Tell them to stop painting. High Coordinator Salverin hissed, eyes locked on the sky beyond the crystalline dome. Cancel the unveiling. There's something wrong with the light. A junior aide, still holding a rolled sheet of pigment reactive silk, blinked toward the dome's refracted horizon. Where once soft violet hues wove between amber clouds, now a sterile sheen had bled across the upper atmosphere. Glossy and colorless, like peeled glass. The crowd outside the ceremonial garden hadn't noticed. They were still gathered in reverent clusters, unaware their skies were being replaced. Salverin turned, robe trailing behind him with a whisper against the bio-grown marble. I want eyes on upper-altitude drift patterns, cross-check with Concord meteorological logs, and recalibrate the skyfield array. If that's an atmospheric anomaly, I want to know what species planted it. 3 aides scrambled, one slipping on the smooth floor as sensor pads flickered alive along the display columns. The High Council chamber, usually occupied with floral pattern debates on interspecies music ethics, pulsed with growing unease. A display projection flared, showing a descending arc, metallic fragments streaking down from orbital heights. Trajectories didn't match any Concord-regulated vessels. Orbital beacon net isn't responding, muttered a technician, voice shallow with disbelief. Repeater signals are being overridden. They're what? Salverin snapped, stepping closer. The technician backed away, his pupils widening as if staring through the display rather than at it. They're reprogramming the satellite scaffolds, overriding with off-architecture command strings. This isn't Concord tech. An alarm trilled. Another tone, lower, meant for catastrophic breach scenarios, overlapped it. That signal hadn't sounded since the Breccian Quarantine Treaty was signed 104 years ago. Salverin watched as the upper atmosphere display rendered its first confirmed intrusion. Angular constructs with mirror-like veins emerged from orbital decay layers. These weren't ships designed for occupation, these were disassembly drones, and they had already begun work on Elgrad's orbital platforms. Broadcast the emergency code, he said quietly. A steward hesitated. Now, full spectrum. Category 7, Sullivan said louder this time. Activate it. All channels, all systems. We do not request assistance. We declare extinction probability. The steward swallowed and obeyed. Across Elgrad space, systems flickered into override. A crystalline pillar rose from the chamber's central dais and cast an amber light into the ceiling aperture. Every frequency the Conquer network had ever sanctioned was seized, filled with one repeating signal. The Elgrad Planetary Distress Beacon, Category 7, Level Extinction. It would loop every 20 seconds across the stars, but not before the second wave arrived. From the far horizon, dark shapes like elongated mantis limbs pierced the clouds, too symmetrical to be natural, too silent to belong. They spread atmospheric processors, black sacs suspended by tethers, expelling invisible particulate. The skies no longer shifted. They thickened. Residents in the high terraces of Erin Garden City looked up and gasped, not from what they saw, but from what they felt. A tightness formed around their chests. Children, confused, clutched their throats as oxygen levels dipped by 2%, then 3%. The air hadn't turned poisonous, it had been rearranged, molecularly rewired to suit something else. Something that wasn't them. Petals fell from blossom towers and did not reach the ground. They withered mid-fall, curling as unseen particles clung to their outer cells. Native birds collapsed mid-flight. Biosynced murals on walls lost their animation, slowing into gray entropy. Salverin's knees struck the floor as he coughed for the first time in public in 23 years. Seal the city domes, another aide yelled. Inject biofilters, stabilize humidity ratios. It won't hold, said the technician, now slumped against the wall. These aren't environmental anomalies. These are invasion protocols. In the command spire, archivist drones spun helplessly in their data cores. Concord treaties, procedural bylaws, non-aggression pacts, they had all assumed contact. There had been no contact. The Valakar Continuum had not issued warnings, sent translators, or requested parley. They had arrived not as conquerors, but as cleaners. And Elgrad was already being erased. In the mountain sanctuary of Viella Ridge, a monastery of kinetic philosophers collapsed in silence as thin-film nanite spores colonized their air supply and decomposed the neural lattice architecture embedded in their walls. In the coral shell village of Arvalspire, the sea receded not due to tide, but because Valakar siphon arrays had begun extracting aquifer cores to alter hydrologic composition. And still the beacon cycled. At the Concord Council's tri-spiral station in neutral space, representatives from 15 systems viewed the Category 7 alert across hollow-legal panels and hesitated. The Zaire Coalition cited border review protocols. The Anthox Protectorate reminded the chamber that the Elgrad system existed in a disputed trade quadrant. The Izorth Syndic pointed out that the Valakar had not yet breached any Concord-claimed systems directly. "We regret the situation deeply," said the Concord speaker, robes impeccable, fingers folded. "But under Article 12, Section 9 of the Interstellar Charter, planetary sovereignty must be respected, unless a formal violation of Concord space occurs. The air is being turned to sledge," said an off-network witness report from an Elgrad station. "My daughter's skin peeled away when we opened the balcony vent." The feed terminated. The beacon cycled. From one of the asteroid-aligned relay hubs came a faint stutter of authorization data, pinged not from a diplomatic vessel, but from an automated threat classification array buried in an old warsat log. The terminal flickered, briefly accessing a defense register over a century out of date. It was tagged Terran. Back on Elgrad, Selvarin stood by the dome aperture, gaze unfocused. "Are they coming?" asked the aide beside him, barely audible through the respirator. He didn't answer. The dome above was no longer transparent. It shimmered as particulate thickened, an oily swirl of muted stars and choking silence. And still, the beacon pulsed. Every 20 seconds. Across the stars. Across systems that heard, weighed, and looked away. Elgrad, the world of biosymphony and crystalline harmonies, had cried out in perfect, unignorable frequency, and was met with deliberate stillness. Until one receiver didn't wait for legal context. Until one protocol didn't pause to assess sovereignty. Until one system logged the Category 7 call, processed it not as a plea, but as a crime in progress, and began to move. Category 7 confirmation received, response, authorization required. The alert tone hadn't echoed through this section of Lunar Command in over 90 years. It came from a buried protocol line. Cold, forgotten, immune to system updates. A floor supervisor reached for her ID badge, paused, and turned to the operator already standing at attention beside the central queue node. The man didn't blink. "Don't wait for council routing," she said. "Trigger cold collapse doctrine, route to directorate oversight, and unseal fallback protocol Tier 9. On an outer rim of Earth's orbital infrastructure, an archaic transmission relay, originally designed for debris net monitoring, lit with authority-grade access it hadn't processed in 3 generations. The beacon from Elgrad had bypassed diplomatic sequencing entirely, flagged not by Concord channels, but by Earth's legacy threat classifier, a code that categorized extinction not as hypothetical, but as an event in motion. The syntax required no deliberation. The beacon matched 4 out of 6 dead zone markers. That was enough. Across 24 silent war satellites, Earth's defensive grid shifted modes. Authority tags altered, targeting permissions adjusted, and, deep beneath the thermally insulated layers of Earth's orbital shadow, Brass Verdict reoriented its spine and turned toward Elgrad. The dreadnought carried no ceremonial markings, no external sponsor livery, no indicator of political allegiance. Its hull was wide-angled, asymmetrical by modern design standards, with external plating that bore impact scarring from a dozen unarchived campaigns. It moved without broadcast signature, and its orbital adjustment was achieved through vented thrust cushions that laced brief trails of sublimating vapor against starlight. Within its command vestibule, automated deployment screens flickered to active, a series of cascading commands initialized embedded routines. Emergency medical substrate printing, exo-atmospheric breach prep, and ground-level atmospheric revalidation systems. Everything spun up in silence, without voice commands or crew chatter. There had been no briefing. No orders beyond the code itself. In Dockwell 2, nested against the spine of the forward operations hull, Strike Team Halberd 3 stepped into deployment sequence. Their boots clanked against the inner ramp of the descent capsule, a vibration that reverberated through the carbon frame and up the vertebrae. One of the operatives, Callan roared, tightened his jaw as the seal hissed shut behind them. "What's the target?" he asked, breaking protocol by speaking first. A heads-up display shimmered to life across his visor, projecting topographic mapping in red and pale violet overlays. None of it was familiar. "The system's called Elgrad. Never heard of it until 10 minutes ago," said Farron Das, tapping the side of his helmet to stabilize calibration drift. "Looks like art world types. No formal military. High biosymbiosis scores. Civilian structures are open frame. They're not ready for what's on them." "Then why send us?" Rudal muttered. "Is we're not here to win a war," came the reply from their commanding operator, Kirin Thalai. His tone held no sentiment. "We're here because the call matched a kill sequence, and Earth doctrine doesn't check for relevance, it responds to metrics." The capsule lock disengaged. Outside, brass verdict aligned with a dark vector path through solar occlusion, traveling below Elgrad's moonlight reflection band. The ship's angle defied orbital physics conventions, not because it had superior tech, but because it bypassed Concord's tether grid entirely. It was moving as if Earth had never signed jurisdiction agreements, because, for this kind of signal, Earth believed those treaties had no standing. The capsule dropped. As it sliced into Elgrad's upper atmosphere, high-velocity descent shields absorbed impact strain and scattered a series of conductive arcs through the clouds. The air screamed around the capsule's spine, not in resonance, but in deformation. The planetary mix had already shifted. They weren't cutting through nitrogen. The sky had been rewritten. Inside, Rob's neck tightened beneath his collar as pressure fluctuations buffeted their path. His gloved hand tightened around the grip bar, more from instinct than fear. "This isn't a deployment. It's a forensic salvage run," Thale said through the feed, eyes flicking across readouts. "The atmosphere's been biologically rethreaded. Our suits will hold, but don't breach external vents. These organisms rewrite respiratory linings." "Why would anyone deploy this kind of operation against a neutral system?" Das asked, half to himself. "Because they're not negotiating," Tala answered. "And we're not either." On the upper edges of Elgrad's horizon, orbital sensors triggered again. The Valakar had noticed movement. Finally. But they didn't recognize it. Brass Verdict still bore no ID signature. Its power levels were staggered through shell compartments designed to emulate a damaged freighter. Even its thermal profile mimicked structural instability. The Valakar designated it as a logistical misfire, a drifting artifact. They didn't recalibrate targeting, which made the first impact a surprise. From behind Elgrad's furthest orbital shadow, Brass Verdicts deployed 3 low-angle kinetic projectiles, sheathless, unguided, locked by gravitational slope. They traveled without emission until final stage ignition, punching through Valakar satellite arrays with enough force to melt their internals before fragmentation registered. The explosions weren't loud in the traditional sense. They folded space like a torn drumhead, sending spirals of warped magnetic debris into neighboring grid points. Within 4 seconds, Elgrad's skies began returning scattered reflections. The Valakar attempted counterlocks, but their targeting sync had assumed dominance. They hadn't considered analog fallback systems. Earth's doctrine never discarded redundancy. From orbit, the old skyhook tether, long abandoned and labeled structurally unstable, reignited. Brass Verdict had slipped a filament pod into its core, bypassing nanite recognition via passive shell dampeners. The tether's pulse ignited a drop sequence. Not personnel, not munitions, inhibitor dust. Engineered for atmospheric rehabilitation during failed terraforming missions, the compound had been modified with dormant parasitic triggers that activated only in environments seeded with active biome conversion agents. The dust was scentless, tasteless, and inert to non-invasive lifeforms. To the Valakar's nanite infrastructure, it was toxic scripture. Groundside, Valakar units began to seize. Their environmental suits clogged at filtration nodes. Respiratory tissue engineered to adapt fluidly across foreign climates began collapsing inward. Some units activated override programs. Others triggered emergency retreat. None stabilized. Still, Brass Verdict made no announcement. Back in the Conquer Tri-Council chamber, arguments bloomed in circular filibusters. A new proposal had been raised: to form a subcommittee on interventional transparency before the next beacon classification vote. By the time the vote concluded, Earth's intervention had been active for 7 hours. By the time the chamber scheduled their next meeting, Halbert 3 had already landed. By the time anyone else noticed Earth was even moving, Elgrad had a chance again. Targeting uplink drift is intentional, Tail said flatly, his eyes tracking along the heads-up display that hovered inside his visor. They've scanned us 3 times and still haven't engaged. They think we're debris. Inside the forward command tier of Brass Verdict, the decision had already been executed 5 minutes prior to Thal's verbal confirmation. The Valakar Continuum swarm logic was rooted in visual confirmation, cross-referenced through identity tags. They relied on predictability. A vessel broadcasted intent, labeled allegiance, offered a handshake, or raised a weapon. Earth's approach was none of these. Their ship moved in silence, masked beneath a radiative envelope engineered to mimic propulsion decay, and in doing so, it slipped beneath every strategic threshold the Valakar had built their doctrine around. What happens when they finally identify us? Farendes asked, securing the last payload anchor inside the capsule's second level. They won't, Tay replied, tapping 3 commands into his panel. By the time they recalibrate, the environment will have collapsed around them. Far above Elgrad's troposphere, 3 kinetic lances detached from the dorsal array of Brass Verdict. They moved without stabilizer fins, lacked active guidance, and bore no drive signature. They were mass, designed for one purpose: impact. As they accelerated along pre-selected gravity ridgelines, the Valakar orbital units held position, mistaking the incoming objects for fragmented orbital ice. Then impact phase ignited. The first lance penetrated the Valakar's primary node satellite, cutting through sensor cores with such violent release that containment gas vented sideways in a plume of fractured panels and crushed anchor spokes. The second obliterated a drone-leg platform before it could deploy its guard spines. The third cracked through a multi-point relay tower, searing a spiral of burning fragments down into Elgrad's mesosphere. From the observation ridge of an abandoned Elgrad arboretum, 2 surviving planetary scientists watched the streaks fall, their faces lit by a bloom of refracted flashes. Neither spoke. Their suits had no uplink. One of them reached for a datapad but found only static. The other began to weep, not from understanding, but because the sky had started punching back. Above them, the old skyhook groaned to life. Considered non-functional for 2 decades, the orbital tether tower had once served as an arts transport conduit, ferrying crystal frame sculptures into space via an analog lift engine. Long since deemed inefficient, it had been repurposed for emergency power routing, then forgotten. Now, as Elgrad choked on its own rewritten air, the tether flared with new purpose. Within the repurposed control loops, Earth's deployed filament core spooled open, transmitting a narrow-range ignition protocol, that realigned the tether's atmospheric pathway. A hissing spool cascade announced its first payload drop, micro-encapsulated inhibitor dust. Drop initiated, Thale announced inside the descending pod. Watch the air readouts, external compositions about to shift. The dust fell like translucent ash, unseen to the naked eye but tracked by sensor clusters embedded in the pod's hull. Each granule carried a passive recombinant chain, designed to activate only upon exposure to biome reconfiguration agents. In clean air, they remained dormant. But Elgrad's sky had already been infected, rewritten with adaptive Valakar agents seeking to overwrite the native biosphere. Once the dust encountered these strands, it restructured its core properties, forming chemical chains that sabotaged replication routines. Valakar ground units, clustered in spy-root cities and terraformed control hubs, began reporting anomalies. Respirator modules flickered with intake warnings. Skin sensors, woven into their suits, lost calibration and began overcorrecting. Adaptive suits flared warning colors across control surfaces, yet no external threats registered. Their atmosphere, until now a tailored cradle, was turning against them. In a Valakar forward operations dome, one coordinator stepped toward the transparency field and noticed the shimmer in the air. Not a cloud, not mist. A slight distortion, like oil suspended across light. Then the field's upper tier collapsed. Suit seams separated, joint vents corroded, muscle augmentation plates fused to skeletal sockets in seconds. Within a minute, 37 operatives lost primary life function, not from projectile or explosion, but from environmental betrayal. The world they had rewritten was rejecting them. Violently, chemically, silently. Onboard brass verdict, system feedback streamed into Thale's console. His fingers danced across the interface as he issued course corrections to maintain the Skyhook's pressure seal. The atmosphere's destabilizing in Tier 2 sectors, he noted. Nanite cycling is shutting down. They're losing command across 5 grid zones. Any transmissions? Roard asked, still clutching the descent harness. Thale didn't look up. Not yet. They haven't figured out where it's coming from. Das laughed once, short and breathless. They're hunting for attackers in the wrong layer. They're searching for noise. We've brought them silence. Outside, entire battalions halted. Tactical consensus algorithms fell into feedback loops as environmental sensors reported unreadable variables. The Valakar strength, total atmospheric assimilation, had become a liability. Their operational platforms were designed for invasion, not recalibration. As the inhibitor dust sank deeper, command signals scattered, corrupted by chemical interference. Several forward squads triggered fail-safe migration. Others initiated Overwatch recall loops and stood motionless under shifting skies. Still, Earth offered no communication, no declaration, no warning. The Concord Chamber, meanwhile, reopened its session to address emerging inconsistencies in Elgrad sensor data. A subcommittee formed to request non-binding audits. One delegate suggested pausing for verification of Valakar activity logs. Another argued for procedural neutrality until visual evidence could be reviewed. At that moment, a Valakar atmospheric recycler imploded over a refugee dome in the Drit Basin. Earth's footage of the event was never sent. Not because it was classified, because it was irrelevant. Back on Elgrad, a child pulled a breathing mask from her face and blinked at the sudden absence of sting in her throat. Her father dropped to his knees and buried his face in her shoulder. For the first time in days, she could smell the air, not fully, not cleanly, but differently. In a reinforced underground corridor below Sector Alice 9, Valakar officers gathered around a tactimetry table, watching their deployment arcs implode one by one. A junior logistics analyst stepped forward, holding a fragment of their environmental data. It was raw, corrupted, indecipherable. He offered it anyway. Anyway, what are we fighting? He asked. No one answered, because whatever it was, hadn't spoken, hadn't broadcast. He hadn't come to explain. It had simply begun to change the rules. Impact pattern's wrong. This isn't a strike, it's a correction, Thale muttered, bracing one hand against the capsule rail, as the feed from Brass Verdict's outer grid fractured. A sudden lurch in the forward axis flung an operator sideways into the bulkhead. Sparks sprayed across the heads-up display, briefly painting the descent chamber in flashes of red and white. Then static. For the first time since atmospheric insertion, the command uplink went dark. On the edge of Elgrad's orbital fringe, a flurry of retaliatory discharges lit up like synchronized detonations from a torchbearer's parade. The Valakar fleet at Station Crossline had reoriented, firing not to probe, but to erase. Ionized payloads surged along pre-mapped vector paths, each one triangulating where Brass Verdict should have been had it continued its prior drift. They struck hard, carving deep into the dreadnought's mid-hull, puncturing comms relays, burning through tertiary propulsion guides. Damage reports staggered in unreadable bursts before transmission cut completely. Control tiers fractured, power grid nodes bled current. The ship staggered in orbital drift, rerouted emergency capacitors, and tilted 5 degrees off axis. Enough for Earth's protocol system to recognize the classification, combat non-communicative state. Tier 7 fallback triggered. A deep core memory vault hissed open behind reinforced paneling in the auxiliary command vault nested 3 layers below ship's surface. 2 security clamps withdrew from a frost-sealed cylinder as nanothermal vents cycled through awakening protocols. It didn't take long. Inside, pulse monitors flared with rising biosignal activity. Muscle reactions surged, eyes opened. Commander Darren Volk sat up before the capsule completed full elevation, skin wet from suspension gel, jaw locked, eyes already scanning the flickering data charts around him. The chamber lights stuttered as the ship rerouted power to Vault systems. Volk exhaled slowly and said, "Status." The AI responded with a voice as cold as the room had been 5 seconds prior. Tier 1 external damage, uplink severed, secondary thrust degraded, external engagement protocol active. Bulky stepped forward, snatching the interface panel from its slide track. His palm print authorization activated 3 laser plasma panels across the vault's rear wall. Each projected operational overlays of the Valakar fleet patterns. He scanned the moving vectors without blinking. "I fired at decay pattern coordinates," he said, frowning. "That means they've seen us long enough to assume we're drifting. They're guessing, not targeting." He leaned closer to a rotating 3D feed of the orbital zone. The Valakar ships were rotating between formations, shifting in loops that overcorrected for phantom readings. Their tracking systems had begun misidentifying nearby objects. Volk's hand hovered over a manual input switch. "Initiate Operation Recoil." "Confirm intent," the AI replied. "Phasic Echo deployment. Decentralized spoof array. Link to planetary weather towers." Command reroute acknowledged. Operation Recoil online. Long before Elgrad skies had filled with spores, its architects had built elaborate weather regulation nodes to maintain ecosystem balance between its floating gardens and aquasphere cities. These nodes were semi-autonomous, updated by local artists and climate composers. Their bandwidth frequencies had never been flagged for military application. Which is why the Valakar overlooked them? Volky hadn't. He opened the archived schematics from Elgrad's planetary lattice and selected 13 weather towers located across the Western Hemisphere. Through low-orbit beamline redirection, he laced synthetic command strings into each, embedding repeating signal bursts that mimicked high-fidelity Valakar communication sequences. Then he seeded visual phantom markers, echo signatures from previous Valakar formation drills, spliced and scrambled. Valakar's own fleet began reacting to ghosts. In orbit, a destroyer rotated to intercept what its system flagged as a stealth-class intrusion pattern. It fired. The pattern vanished, reappeared on its opposite flank, multiplied, then disappeared entirely. A second Valakar ship spun in panic, broadcasting invalid formation commands. Within 4 minutes, 7 ships realigned and opened fire, on one another. Volky watched through a direct link to the orbital surveillance feed, his face blank. "Run Delta check on IFF corruption," he ordered. "Swarm architecture interpreting atmospheric signal ghosts as verified threats," the AI reported. Target logic looped. He tapped a console key to magnify 3 conflict zones on the plasma wall. "Adjust carrier frequency 3 notches below baseline. Amplify the node broadcasts. Shift echo positions every 13 seconds. Never the same coordinate twice." The AI executed. Outside, the Valakar fleet shattered its cohesion. Rapid lock systems cycled into frenzy, generating target pings faster than validation scripts could run. Dozens of swarm drones, misled by the phasic echoes, triggered on their own command ships. Feedback alarms went unanswered. Internal failsafes fell into recursive loops. What had been a coordinated formation devolved into spastic arcs of self-inflicted fire. Inside the fallback chamber, Volky stepped back from the command panel and stripped the fluid harness from his forearms. His voice didn't rise. His movements never rushed. "This is what they built their strength on," he muttered. "Repetition. Response. Reflex. But when reflex turns on itself, there's nothing left but noise." Below the orbital theater, Elgrad's planetary skies began stabilizing as fallout from the fleet's disruption cut power to several nanite dispersal hubs. Air quality readings showed slow normalization. Children emerged from shelters, their skin no longer peeling. Bioglass rooftops stopped crackling with molecular stress. Survivors didn't understand the reason. They saw the light return and dared to hope. Oak didn't speak again for several minutes. The AI broke the silence. "Fleet Chaos Index rising. Estimated 32% of remaining Valakar force now engaged with phantom returns." He walked to the viewing slit at the rear of the vault and stared out into space. "You don't match rage with more rage," he said quietly. "You trick it into tearing its own throat." And far above Elgrad, the war raged. Louder, sharper, confused. Without Earth needing to fire another shot. "Mirror their hierarchy," Volk said, eyes fixed on the flickering lattice of moving symbols spread across the curved laser plasma screen. "Don't spoof targets. Echo the command structure." Inside the secondary command deck of Brass Verdict, the AI cross-thread 13 new signal paths through the weather node interface below Elgrad's crust. Each projection wasn't designed to look like enemy units. It mimicked leadership identifiers, reconfiguring ghost signals to impersonate Valakar command echoes. From orbit, it resembled a rogue command faction issuing live orders. Volky's system didn't broadcast threat. It whispered commands the enemy trusted, but twisted them. The swarm logic architecture used by the Valakar was fast, violently so, but the same neural compression that made them efficient in close combat formations also made them brittle in noise. Swarm response wasn't strategic, it was consensus-based. Target confirmation didn't come from individual ships. It came from an aggregate belief in signal integrity. If enough signals agreed, then any object became a threat. Volky had built a sequence to mislead that belief. He paced back toward the main rail. His steps echoed softly against the reinforced composite deck as operators monitored the shifts. On the plasma wall, red arcs of active engagement flickered against cyan indicators. Dozens of Valakar units now firing into mirrored positions held by phantoms. Entire tridents of their fleet peeled off and launched coordinated barrages into empty sky, guided by nothing but illusion. "This isn't combat anymore," Das murmured behind him, watching the signature readouts pulse. "They are chasing shadows with live ordnance." "Not shadows," Volk corrected. "Ghosts of their own hierarchy." His voice was steady, not boastful. There was no celebration in it. Volky hadn't constructed this operation for victory. He'd built it to collapse a way of thinking. Not with bombs, with contradiction. In the high layer above Elgrad's stratosphere, a Valakar carrier veered sideways, its external signal repeaters misidentifying 2 scout wings as rogue assets. It launched a proximity charge meant for fleet dispersal. The scout wings retaliated by sending a kill loop to the carrier's escort shells, which rerouted their cannons onto formation allies. Within 3 minutes, every ship within that arc was exchanging fire. None of them under human command. The dreadnought hadn't moved. "Feedback rate?" Volky asked. "Climbing," the AI responded. "Each secondary IFF cascade results in a net loss of coordination. Median fleet cohesion has dropped below 38%. Swarm logic has fragmented." Volky tilted his head. "Run a phase crawl on the Eastern Hemisphere weather grid. They're still too focused on orbit. Let's push another echo bank through that gap." A fresh wave of ghost patterns triggered in the lower atmospheres of Elgrad's coastal ridgelines, this time camouflaged within rainstorms seeded days earlier by Valacar terraforming. The false signals pulsed from inside native cloud masses. Dozens of Valacar drones rerouted groundward, chasing what appeared to be enemy jamming buoys. They hit nothing. One collided with a civilian comms tower and exploded in open air. Another fired at a weather balloon, confused by the shape of the payload struts. Each time they missed, their AI routines reclassified the failure as stealth evasion and doubled targeting resolution. This created new phantom targets, escalating loop density. In the southern capital ruins of Arvanel Core, survivors hiding under shattered leaf glass archways began to notice something odd. The air, once tainted and heavy with particulate that scraped the throat, had thinned. Wind returned, not as a violent gust, but as a clean, cold stir through broken corridors. The sky shifted. Not fully blue, not yet clean, but no longer thick with filament haze, and the drones, the massive forms that had once prowled overhead, were now weaving into each other mid-flight, crashing into towers, firing into distant tree lines that held nothing but wind. One young boy climbed atop the skeletal frame of a shattered biodome and squinted upward. He saw trails of light loop in chaotic spirals, followed by ruptures that threw silent shock waves across the canopy. His sister stood beside him, covering her ears from instinct, though nothing made noise anymore. The weapons were silent. The war was silent. The death was being rewritten by signals. Inside Brass Verdict, Tale glanced toward Volk. "You could have just launched a strike. One clean burst, target their core logic clusters, end it in seconds." Volky didn't look away from the board. "Ending it isn't the point." Tale leaned forward. "Then what is?" Volky finally turned. "If we destroy them outright, the system they trust remains intact. But if it unravels by their own hands, if their logic consumes itself, then they won't build from it again. They'll fear its architecture." "And Earth?" Thale asked. "What's our place in this?" Volka walked toward the rear viewport. Through reinforced glass, the planet below drifted in slow rotation. Elgrad's greens were returning, blurred, incomplete, but visible again. Civilian shelters flickered with tentative power. No flags had been raised, no declarations were broadcast. Earth hadn't claimed territory. There were no boots on the ground, only signals. "We're not arbiters," Volky said quietly. "Not saviors, not colonists, not heroes. We're a correction, that's all." The AI interjected. "Valacar command stream has collapsed. 7 fleet segments have defaulted to autonomous survival mode. They're retreating in erratic vectors." Volky gave no reaction. He watched one Valacar cruiser detonate after misidentifying its own propulsion wake as hostile. Then he turned off the feed. "Let the silence finish what we started," he said. And above the broken skies of a recovering world, the brass-clad dreadnought drifted still, unmoving, expressionless. A blade sheathed in logic. A presence not meant to lead, to dominate, or to linger. A force only summoned when others refused to answer. "They're going to sterilize the planet," Tale said, his voice dropping into a register that didn't match the data points flashing across his heads-up display. They've pushed to internal command fallback. All indicators suggest they're bringing Delta online. Volk didn't respond at first. He stood near the left support strut of the neural control arc, watching the projection panels above him scroll through volatile threat curves. Each vector blinked red, not from movement, but because the command structure embedded in Valakar fleet logic had defaulted to a catastrophic algorithm. Purge Protocol Delta was designed not for conquest, but erasure. If activated, it would release a bioagent capable of reducing every organic lattice on Elgrad to inert carbon fragments in under 3 hours. Cities would decay, forests would liquefy, DNA signatures would unravel mid-replication. He pressed his thumb to a secondary switch embedded along the inner curve of the display. A different interface slid open, non-tactical, diagnostic. His eyes narrowed. "They're not doing this out of control," he said finally. "This is measured retaliation." "Out of spite?" Das asked from behind the tactical board. "Out of fear," Volk corrected. "They don't know what happened. They've lost cohesion. Their neural feed is looping, but they still believe they can define the end." Below the orbital threshold, deep in the decaying framework of a scorched communications array, one relay shard blinked back to life. Dislodged during the initial satellite strikes and caught in the lower debris band, the shard's casing bore fractures and its outer signal panel flickered inconsistently, but it had retained its core buffer. And in the last cycle, it received a trigger. An encrypted microsequence unfolded. Not a command, not a call for help, a reminder, nested in pre-signed logic. The relay linked to a secondary frequency band known only to Earth's cold collapse units, and one other source, the original Valakar biosphere reference hash. Volky watched the relay's activation sequence unfold on the plasma projection, the glyph trails cascading downward like script carved into weathered metal. "It's sending an echo." Dale stepped forward. "An attack?" "No," Volk murmured, eyes locked on the configuration. "An implication." The message embedded in the shard didn't carry threats or deployment codes. It carried a strand of encrypted data formatted in the syntactic framework of Valakar's homeworld biosignature. The structure was elegantly mutated, resembling a sterilization strand, but just misaligned enough to suggest external tampering. No signal declared intent. No origin was traced. There was no traceable IP flag. The only certainty was this. The data looked familiar, too familiar. Folly leaned in. Confusion etched into his face. Is that their own extinction code?" "Or a version of it," Volk replied. "Clever enough to be taken seriously, incomplete enough to remain deniable. We seeded the possibility. We didn't confirm it. That's the only layer that matters." Valley stepped back. "So the implication is, Earth already reached them?" Volker didn't answer immediately. He watched the signals spiral through the lower atmosphere, watched as the debris relay pulsed again, and then flickered off. "Let them assume it," he said. "Fear works better when it arrives as a question." In orbit, Valakar command ships began to silence one another's crossfeeds. A dozen support units stopped moving mid-formation. One carrier vessel, the same that had aligned its grid for the purge activation, rotated toward the relay's last ping and froze. Engines cooled, cannons retracted, biotethered ships flickered with low signal bursts, querying for verification. No confirmation returned. Nothing denied it either. On Elgrad, winds that once carried toxins now drifted empty, the air light enough that plants swayed again. Green returned in faint patches across broken terrace rows. A child peered upward from beneath a fractured glass arch, expecting fire. It never came. Inside Brass Verdict, the screens dimmed. Volk watched as fleet telemetry stuttered. Disarray faded not through combat but silence. One by one, the Valakar fleet began to power down subsystems, not fully retreating, not yet, but halting deployment. Their aggression dissolved under weightless paranoia. "They've stopped," Das whispered. "No weapon struck them," Thale muttered, glancing at the logs. "Exactly," Volker replied. "It's the absence that breaks them. They thought Earth attacked the planet. Now they believe we reached their home first." Thale frowned. "Did we?" Vogel stepped away from the display. "It doesn't matter. The question's in their bloodstream now. They'll never extract it." "ETH, post-correction update link, except..." He pulled a manual override chip from his sleeve, slotted it into the lower deck reader, and rerouted command of the orbital countermeasures. Nothing deployed, it was just a procedural lockout, a soft disengagement. A gesture. He was telling the system Earth wouldn't fire unless provoked again. But it wasn't meant for Earth. It was meant for the enemy's analysts, watching every move, trying to parse what they couldn't see. Volky moved to the viewport and stared through the shielding. Stillness hung over the planet. No one called for rescue. No beacon was answered. The dreadnought hadn't fired another lance. Yet the skies stayed whole. He folded his arms and spoke once, almost to himself. "A weapon isn't what you launch. It's what they believe you've already delivered." And the Valakar, engines cooling in uncertain orbit, believed it. "Contact loss across all Valakar battle groups," Thale reported, watching the final laser plasma panel dim as the orbital telemetry collapsed into neutral drift. "They're pulling back, not retreating under fire, just exiting." Volky gave no command. He didn't have to. The entire bridge already understood what that meant. The enemy hadn't been defeated by force. They'd been cornered by inference. Inside the atmospheric vault of brass verdict, lights dimmed to amber, power cells realigned, and the once vibrating nodes along the dorsal heat sink slowed into passive function. The dreadnought's forward coil disengaged from orbital stabilization, and its propulsion chamber cooled beneath guided venting. Without haste or ceremony, Earth's warship rotated away from Elgrad's orbital alignment and entered silent drift, coasting toward a lower gravity exit point that required no active thrust. It didn't flee. It didn't patrol. It left, deliberately, without closure. Down on the surface, the Purge Protocol Delta ignition matrix, still charging inside the Valakar central relay, dimmed and expired. No transmission confirmed the cancellation. The screens went dark. 1 second, it had been an extinction trigger. The next, it was obsolete code, discarded without remark. High above, the skyhook tether, which had funneled Earth's engineered inhibitor dust into the atmosphere, now stood dormant. Each capsule ejection cycle slowed. Within hours, the last dose was dispersed. The tether sealed its access doors without mechanical groan or powered withdrawal. It simply ceased its rhythm and locked into permanent stasis. Halberd 3, still deployed in the subsurface reclamation chambers beneath Arvanel Core, initiated planetary stabilization routines. Automated filtration spires bloomed like skeletal towers, unfurling sky-anchored banners that filtered lingering atmospheric toxicity. Thermal data rebalanced. Chlorophyll sequences registered measurable recovery. The air thinned back to breathable thresholds. Not every biosystem survived, but enough remained to rebuild. Enough for life to choose again? In a shallow valley once blanketed in spore saturation, a teenage boy stirred awake. His fingers curled into the soft layer of recovered moss beneath him. He sat up slowly, chest rising and falling without rasp or sting. Overhead, fractured light passed through thinning clouds. He looked around, confused. No drones remained, no ships hovered. Just a sky that looked real again. The stabilization tower beside him flickered once, briefly, and folded inward like a flower out of bloom. It had completed its task. No beacons remained, no flags rose. On the Elgrad Central Council steps, coordinators stood in ceremonial rows, robes faded, faces hollowed from sleepless days underground. High Coordinator Salvaran stepped forward with a small data wand. He tapped once. A signal flared across orbital frequency. To Earth Command, Terran Directorate, or whomever your authorization designates, Elgrad extends formal gratitude for the preservation of our people. We cannot quantify your intervention. We cannot repay what was prevented. But we offer acknowledgement, recognition, respect. No reply came. A full planetary rotation passed, then another. The dreadnought had vanished beyond gravitational lock and faded into deep drift. Its signature had never been shared. Its trajectory had not been logged. Elgrad's skies remained clear. By the third day, population clusters emerged from bio-caverns and bunkers. Disconnected families reunited without fanfare, stunned by survival. The plant life once engineered to sing with atmospheric data had no music left to play, but it stood. A kind of sacred stillness filled the broken plazas. In the planetary archive vaults, newly rebuilt screens displayed filtered recordings gathered from surviving satellites. Most of the footage showed confusion. Valacar formations attacking one another, tactical loops folding inward, skies warping with error signals. None of it showed Earth's vessels delivering commands. None captured Volky's voice. No footage caught a single human operative speaking. One video, however, began circulating in private channels among surviving engineers. It showed the moment the inhibitor dust ceased deployment. The screen captured the tether's final capsule seal itself. Then, a faint glint in the atmosphere as the cloud dispersed. A silhouette of brass verdict gliding away. Not firing, not broadcasting, just aligning with the stars and entering drift. There was no watermark, no emblem, just silence and movement. Coordinator Salvaran played the clip twice, then turned to his advisors and said, "They didn't come for reward. They didn't arrive for recognition. They didn't even stay long enough to witness what they saved," his aide added. Salvaran nodded once. "Because they don't need to be seen, only to be felt." In the corner of a shelter where rescued children were receiving nutrient rations, one girl pointed at the arc of clouds thinning above and asked, "Are they still up there?" Her caretaker paused. "I don't think they ever were," he replied, "not really. They came when it mattered, and they left when it didn't." In Earth's off-net archives, the mission file was stamped with a 3-word code. Response, registered, closed. No commentary followed. No medals were issued. There was no ceremony, no parade, no internal broadcast. The name Darren Volk never appeared in any external log. No crew lists were leaked. No sensor trail tracked brass verdict's return vector. Earth didn't need to declare what it had done. The galaxy would do that for them. "You mean to tell me they never declared intent?" High Consul Viren asked, her words snapping across the Concord Council chamber like a splintered wire. Not one document? Not even a time-stamped justification? The inquiry delegate from Zarel pressed his palms flat against the table's edge. There was no dialogue to record, no diplomatic route to trace. Earth never entered a claim. They responded to an extinction-class beacon, completed a single cycle operation, and left. The chamber's floor light dimmed beneath legal charter projections, page after page of interspecies intervention law scrolling in the background. None of it had been referenced before Earth acted. And now, all of it was irrelevant. The walls of Concord's spire echoed with quiet commotion as a dozen systems representatives argued over definitions that had never been tested. Jurisdictional validity, unilateral military deployment, unauthorized biosphere interference. Each clause met with hesitation as footage from Elgrad continued to circulate across neutral networks. None of the files originated from Terran systems. They were leaked through decommissioned satellite archives, time-stamped and unedited. The footage wasn't cinematic. It showed confusion. It showed drifting dreadnought mass, It showed environmental stabilization where nothing should have lived. One fragment looped repeatedly on side panels, the exact moment the Valakar fleet disengaged. And at the end of every recording, embedded in the data core, was a single embedded string of text. Response registered, no fee required. Historians from 17 different civilizations began requesting unrestricted access to Earth's old cold collapse protocols. For centuries, the doctrine had been regarded as overreach, outdated war logic from a species still emotionally tethered to survival instinct. In Concord schools, Earth's reaction-first protocols had been dismissed as frontier paranoia. Now, they were being re-evaluated as something else entirely. Preemptive ethical infrastructure. A moral response framework engineered not for aggression, but for guaranteed reaction when neutrality became deadly. Where the galaxy froze in legality, Earth moved. Where others waited to be authorized, Earth determined the event by consequence. Across diplomatic threads, a phrase re-emerged, one thought extinguished: Terran Rage Doctrine. In cultural symposiums, Elgrad's recovery was dissected without sentiment. No effort had been made by Earth to connect afterward. No ambassador followed. No materials were exchanged. No post-conflict presence remained. The entire intervention had been surgical, self-contained, and unbranded. And it worked. Not because Earth had more power, because it had prepared for the moment when no one else would act. Back on Elgrad, the Recovery Guild erected a new chamber near the old Biosymphony concert dome. It wasn't a memorial. There were no flags or names. It held only one object: an incomplete telemetry recording from the moment the inhibitor dust ended its cycle. The image frame captured the silhouette of the Terran dreadnought in the upper sky. The photo was blurred by the atmosphere, half obscured by scattering clouds. Beneath the image, etched into the floor with no artistic embellishment, were 6 words. They came, they never stayed. At the far end of the conquered spire, Consul Viren stepped away from the final hearing of the day, her hands shaking as she pressed them against the railing overlooking the lower plaza. She spoke to no one in particular. They weren't late because they hesitated. They were late because they never assumed they'd be asked. From the shadows behind her, a diplomat from the independent Vasari Confederation folded his arms. They answered a death call with coordination no empire could afford. And then they disappeared. Viren's voice faltered. So what does that make them now? Enforcers? Arbitrators? No, he said after a long pause. It makes them unshakable. Because their wrath was never about conquest. It was about correctness. Somewhere in a Terran archival vault, hundreds of light years away, Commander Volk's biometric record deactivated from mission chain. No fanfare followed. His designation reverted to dormant classification. His name wasn't included in any after-action report. Not because it was removed, because it was never entered. Volk stood alone at the edge of an observation corridor, watching stars pass beyond reinforced glass, arms crossed behind his back. The data reel in his hand wasn't blinking. It didn't need to. He turned to the neural terminal beside him and issued a single verbal input. Seal response chain, classify event as concluded, no distribution. The terminal blinked once in acknowledgement. He lingered, eyes fixed on the dark. No applause waited. No counsel hailed him. No record bore his decision-making imprint. His action had been Earth's action, and Earth had chosen to speak through result, not rhetoric. Volk didn't move as the corridor lights dimmed. Somewhere behind him, the ship's course shifted toward an empty quadrant without name. In the conquered archives, planetary response systems began to integrate new rules, based not on treaties, but on survival conditions. Dozens of systems rewrote their own beacon classifications to include Terran-style triggers. Because the moment had passed, but the model remained. Across outer systems, the story began to evolve. It was no longer about Earth's retaliation. It was about the silence they answered, and the silence they left behind. They hadn't responded out of allegiance. They hadn't retaliated for fame. They weren't summoned through bribes, alliances, or negotiation. They moved because the emergency was real, because everyone else stood still, and because the angry humans were the only ones who still remembered what rage meant when weaponized by purpose. They didn't seek permission. They answered, they corrected, and then they left. What would your species do if the galaxy ignored your extinction call? Would you wait for diplomacy? Or hope humanity still listens? Comment below with your thoughts and tell us, was Earth right to act without permission? If you want more cold, calculated, and emotionally charged HFY stories that redefine revenge, war, and survival, hit that subscribe button now and never miss what happens when humanity answers the call.